On a cold December night in the year 1776, George Washington made a desperate crossing of the Delaware River, his troops exhausted, the revolution hanging by a thread. What happened next would shape history, but not in the way you might expect. As the story goes, a mysterious figure appeared to Washington in the snow that night, whispering guidance that led to a pivotal victory. Later, Washington himself would call it nothing short of divine intervention, and he wasn't alone. Across centuries and continents, in moments of crisis and wonder, people have reported encounters so extraordinary, so inexplicable, they could only be described as miracles. This isn't just about faith, it's about the countless moments where history itself seems to bend under the weight of something beyond our understanding. From ancient battlefields to modern hospitals, stories of divine intervention weave through every culture, every era. They challenge skeptics, comfort believers, and leave even the most rational minds wondering, is there something or someone guiding the threads of our lives? These aren't just tales passed down through generations. They're records etched into history, eyewitness accounts, documented events, and mysteries that defy logic. Whether it's a sudden storm scattering an invincible armada, a voice in the darkness leading a child to safety, or a vision that alters the course of a war, these stories share one electrifying thread, the unmistakable feeling that something greater stepped in. Today, we're diving into 25 of the most astonishing accounts of divine intervention ever recorded. Some will be familiar, like the angelic armies said to have appeared over the trenches of World War I. Others are hidden gems, like the 19th century village saved from plague by a prayer no one expected to be answered. Each story is a window into the unexplainable, a reminder that history isn't just shaped by kings and generals, but by moments that transcend human power. So settle in, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about luck, fate, and the forces that move our world. The only question left is, are you ready to believe? In the quiet fields of Fátima, Portugal, in the year 1917, 3 shepherd children claimed to encounter a luminous woman who would change their lives and captivate the world. Over several months, she appeared to them, sharing secrets and prophecies that ranged from the end of World War I to the rise and fall of nations. But it was her final appearance on October 13th that would shock the globe. That day, 70,000 people, farmers, skeptics, journalists, even atheists, gathered in the pouring rain, drawn by rumors of miracles. Then something impossible happened. The clouds parted and the sun began to spin like a fiery wheel, casting kaleidoscopic light across the landscape. Witnesses described it plunging toward the earth before soaring back into the sky, leaving the soaked crowd suddenly dry, their clothes untouched by the earlier downpour. Scientists scrambled for explanations: mass hallucination, a rare atmospheric phenomenon. Yet how could 70,000 people share the same hallucination? Even secular newspapers reported the event, their journalists shaken by what they'd seen. Skeptics dismissed it as collective hysteria, but the children's prophecies, once ridiculed, began to unfold with eerie precision. One prediction about an evening light signaling another great war was linked by believers to the aurora borealis that lit European skies on the night World War II began. The Catholic Church, after decades of investigation, declared the Fátima events worthy of belief, cementing its place as one of the most scrutinized and enduring miracles of modern times. What makes Fátima extraordinary isn't just the spectacle, but the ripple effects. Pilgrims still flock to the site, claiming healings and conversions. Scientists still debate it, unable to replicate or dismiss it fully. And for those who stood in that field, the question lingered: was it a celestial anomaly or something far more profound? The answer may depend on who you ask, but for 70,000 people on a rainy October day, the sun didn't just shine. It danced. The muddy trenches of World War I were no place for miracles, or so the soldiers thought. In August 1914, during the brutal Battle of Mons, British troops found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, facing wave after wave of German advancement. Exhausted and desperate, they braced for annihilation. Then something impossible happened. As the bullets flew, men from multiple regiments later swore they saw them. Tall, radiant figures standing between the trenches, their swords gleaming against the smoke. Some described winged warriors holding back the enemy advance. Others spoke of phantom archers raining arrows no German soldier could escape. The legend of the Angel of Mons was born, spreading through the ranks like wildfire. News of the celestial intervention reached home, where British newspapers seized on the story as divine proof their cause was just. But was it heavenly aid or wartime folklore? The tale took on a life of its own, with reports of spectral bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt joining the fray, tying England's medieval past to its modern struggle. Later investigations revealed no official military records mentioning angels, leading skeptics to call it mass exhaustion or even covert British propaganda to boost morale. Yet the soldiers who swore they saw the figures never wavered in their accounts, even years after the war. One private wrote home, "I'd have called it madness too if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." What's fascinating isn't just the mystery of what truly happened that day, but why the legend persists. In the face of industrialized slaughter, the Angel of Mons became more than a story, it was comfort. A sign that even in hell's darkest corners, something watched over the doomed and the desperate. Modern historians suggest the tale might have roots in a wartime short story published weeks earlier, blurring fiction with battlefield trauma. But for those who clung to the vision in the trenches, no debunking could erase what they believed they witnessed. Whether divine intervention, collective hallucination, or the human mind's desperate coping mechanism, one thing remains. Over a century later, we're still asking what really appeared in the smoke over Mons. And perhaps that question, more than any answer, is what keeps the legend alive. Alexander the Great stood on the shores of the Mediterranean, staring at the island city of Tyre, a fortress that had never fallen. It was the year 332 before the Common Era, and this tiny island held the key to his conquest of Persia, but Tyre was no ordinary target. Surrounded by towering walls and treacherous waters, it was considered impregnable. Alexander's engineers told him it would take months, maybe years, to build a causeway long enough to reach the island. His generals urged him to bypass it altogether, but the young conqueror refused. That night, as he slept in his tent, something extraordinary happened. According to ancient historians, Alexander dreamed of a radiant figure. Some say the god Heracles, others claim it was the sea god Poseidon, standing at the edge of the waves. The figure pointed toward the island, then to the waters, as if revealing a hidden path. When Alexander awoke, he called for his engineers and ordered them to begin construction immediately, using rubble from the abandoned mainland city to build a massive land bridge. What followed was one of the most audacious military feats in history. For 7 months, his men worked under constant fire from Tyrian archers and ships. They faced storms, disease, and near mutiny, yet somehow, piece by piece, the causeway inched closer. Then, at the height of the siege, a second sign appeared. A flock of eagles sacred to Zeus flew over Alexander's army before circling the city walls. His troops took it as divine approval. Days later, the causeway reached the island, and Alexander's forces stormed Tyre in a brutal assault. The victory was so complete, so improbable, that even his enemies whispered of divine intervention. Later, Alexander himself would dedicate offerings at the temple of Heracles in Tyre, as if repaying a celestial debt. But here's where history and myth collide. Some scholars argue the dream was a clever propaganda tool, meant to inspire his superstitious troops. Others point to Alexander's well-documented habit of interpreting omens to justify his ambitions. Yet the sheer impossibility of the siege success begs the question, Was it all strategy, or did something or someone tip the scales? The answer may lie in the aftermath. Unlike other conquered cities, Tyre's fall didn't just cement Alexander's reputation, it shifted the balance of the ancient world overnight. Maybe that's the true mark of divine intervention, when history pivots on a moment so unlikely, even the skeptics pause. Deep in the wilderness of Midian, a shepherd named Moses stumbled upon a sight that would alter the course of history, a bush engulfed in flames, yet somehow untouched by the fire. As he drew closer, a voice thundered from the blaze, commanding him to remove his sandals, for he stood on holy ground. This moment, recorded in the book of Exodus around the 13th century before the Common Era, wasn't just a supernatural encounter. It was the spark that ignited one of the most profound liberation movements in human history. The voice from the burning bush identified itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, calling Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage. But what makes this story remarkable isn't just the miracle itself, it's the theological earthquake it triggered. For the first time in recorded scripture, divinity revealed itself as a singular, omnipotent force, declaring, "I am who I am." This phrase, revered in Hebrew as Yahweh, became the bedrock of monotheism, setting Judaism, and later Christianity and Islam apart from the polytheistic world around them. Artists across millennia have tried to capture the paradox of the burning bush, a fire that doesn't consume, a voice that doesn't fade. Medieval illuminated manuscripts depicted it with golden flames licking at emerald leaves, while Renaissance painters framed Moses' awe with dramatic chiaroscuro. Yet the deeper miracle lies in the story's enduring resonance. Modern parallels emerge in unexpected places like the civil rights movement, where leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. drew direct inspiration from Exodus, framing racial justice as a divine mandate. Skeptics have proposed natural explanations, suggesting the bush might have been a rare desert plant that emits flammable gases, or a hallucination born of desert heat and solitude. But for believers, the power of the story has never rested in its scientific plausibility. It's about what followed: the plagues, the parted sea, the forging of a covenant that would shape 3 world religions. The burning bush wasn't just a miracle, it was a turning point, a reminder that sometimes divinity speaks through the ordinary, a shepherd, a bush, a voice in the wilderness, to set in motion the extraordinary. Twice in the span of 7 years, the Mongol Empire, the most formidable military force the world had ever seen, turned its gaze toward Japan. And twice, nature itself seemed to rise in the island nation's defense. In 1274 and again in 1281, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, launched massive invasion fleets to conquer Japan. His armies had already swallowed empires from China to Persia, leaving terror in their wake. Japan, fractured by civil wars and unprepared for such an onslaught, should have been an easy conquest. But then the skies darkened and the seas raged. The first invasion fleet, boasting nearly 900 ships and 40,000 warriors, landed at Hakata Bay in 1274. For days, the samurai fought desperately, outmatched by the Mongols' superior tactics and terrifying gunpowder weapons. Just as collapse seemed inevitable, a typhoon of unprecedented fury struck. Ships were dashed against cliffs like toys, drowning thousands. The survivors who limped back to Korea spoke of waves like mountains and winds that howled like vengeful spirits. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind, believing the storm was sent by the gods to protect their sacred islands. 7 years later, Kublai Khan tried again, this time with an even larger force, over 4,000 ships and an estimated 140,000 men. The invasion stretched Japan's defenders to the breaking point. For nearly 2 months, the samurai held the beaches through brutal attrition. Then, on the 15th of August 1281, another typhoon erupted. This one was worse. Contemporary accounts describe ships lifted from the water and flung inland, Mongol warriors impaled on splintered masts, and the sea itself turning black with wreckage. The few survivors who made it back to the mainland whispered that the storm had teeth that had hunted them. Historians still debate whether these typhoons were miracles or just brutal luck. Meteorologists point to the region's notorious storm season, suggesting the Mongols simply gambled poorly with nature. But the timing defies coincidence. Both storms struck at the precise moment Japan's defeat seemed certain. For the Japanese, the message was clear. Their islands were under divine protection. The kamikaze became central to their national identity, a symbol of heavenly favor that endured for centuries. During World War II, suicide pilots would even adopt the name, hoping to channel that same celestial intervention. What's fascinating isn't just the storm's ferocity, but how they reshaped history. Had either invasion succeeded, Japan might have been absorbed into the Mongol Empire, altering the cultural and political landscape of Asia forever. Instead, the kamikaze cemented Japan's belief in its unique destiny, a nation shielded by the gods themselves. Skeptics can call it weather, believers call it proof, but perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in those rare moments when history hinges on forces beyond kings or armies, and the wind itself seems to choose a side. The dusty roads of Jericho were crowded that day, beggars lining the streets, merchants haggling over spices, Roman soldiers patrolling with bored disdain. Among them sat Bartimaeus, a blind man whose world had been darkness for years. Then the rumors reached him: Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. What happened next wasn't just a healing. It became one of the most layered miracles in the Gospels, a story preserved across multiple accounts, yet rich with subtle differences that reveal early Christianity's evolving understanding of divine power. Mark's Gospel, written closest to the events around the year 70 of the Common Era, paints the scene with vivid urgency. Bartimaeus isn't passive. He shouts over the crowd, ignoring those who try to silence him. When Jesus calls for him, he throws off his cloak, a detail often overlooked but loaded with symbolism. In antiquity, a beggar's cloak was his livelihood. It collected alms by day, served as a blanket by night. To cast it aside was an act of radical trust, a physical manifestation of the faith Jesus would praise. Matthew's version adds a fascinating twist. There are two blind men. Scholars debate whether this reflects an oral tradition variant or a theological choice. Matthew often doubles elements like demon-possessed men in Gadara to emphasize communal redemption. Luke, writing for a Gentile audience, streamlines the account but highlights the crowd's reaction, showing the miracle as public proof of Jesus' authority. These variations aren't contradictions, they're like facets of a gem, each revealing a different angle of early Christian thought. At its core, the story subverts expectations. In the ancient world, blindness was often seen as divine punishment. Yet Jesus doesn't ask Bartimaeus to prove his worthiness. He asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" The question is startling in its simplicity, echoing God's query to Solomon, "Ask what I shall give you," and framing healing as a collaboration between divine power and human desire. Bartimaeus' reply, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight," uses a rare Greek verb, enablepo, implying not just physical sight but insight, a theme early Christians seized upon. The miracle's aftermath is equally revealing. Bartimaeus doesn't return home, he follows Jesus on the way, a phrase Mark's original audience would recognize as code for the path to the cross. Here, physical sight becomes spiritual discipleship. Early Christian art often depicted this moment, showing Bartimaeus touching Jesus' robe as a prototype for later believers seeking contact with the divine. Modern skeptics might dismiss the story as legend, but its cultural impact is undeniable. From Augustine's sermons linking Bartimaeus' blindness to humanity's sin, to Martin Luther's Reformation-era interpretation of the cloak as shedding old religious systems, this miracle transcends its historical moment. Perhaps that's the true mark of divine intervention, not just the restoration of sight, but a story that continues to make the scales fall from new eyes century after century. The year was 1429 and France was bleeding. The 100 Years' War had left the country fractured, its crown prince disinherited by foreign invaders. Then came a girl just 17, illiterate, and from an obscure village who claimed saints spoke to her in flashes of light. Her name was Joan of Arc, and what followed wasn't just military triumph. It was a collision of the divine and the political that still echoes through history. Joan's story begins with voices. At 13, she said the Archangel Michael appeared in her father's garden, followed by Saints Catherine and Margaret, their faces radiant with compassion. They didn't whisper prayers, they gave orders. Go to Captain Robert de Baudricourt, they instructed. He will take you to the Dauphin. When she finally reached the future Charles Roman VII, she stunned his court by revealing secrets only he could know. Private prayers, doubts he'd never voiced. Historians still puzzle over how a peasant girl could navigate royal politics with such precision. Was it divine insight, or had she somehow gained clandestine coaching? Then came the miracles on the battlefield. Clad in white armor she'd never worn before, Joan broke the siege of Orleans in just 9 days, a feat seasoned generals had failed to achieve in months. Witnesses described her predicting exact moments English fortifications would fall, rallying troops with an uncanny knowledge of terrain. At Patay, her forces annihilated an English army 10 times their size with barely any losses. Military historians call her tactics brilliant but inexplicable for someone with no formal training, but it's her trial that reveals the deepest mystery. Captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English, Joan faced execution unless she renounced her voices. The trial records meticulously preserved show her outmaneuvering trained theologians. When asked if she was in God's grace, a theological trap, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Even her jailers reported seeing a strange light in her cell the night before her burning. Modern explanations range from temporal lobe epilepsy, which can trigger vivid auditory hallucinations, to political fabrication, but none fully explain her battlefield prescience or the enduring power of her legacy. Less than 30 years after her death, the Church overturned her heresy conviction. In 1920, she was canonized, a saint who'd led armies, a mystic who'd changed history. Perhaps the truest miracle isn't whether the voices were real, but how a teenage girl's unshakable faith turned the tide of a century-long war. In the end, Joan's greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was proving that sometimes the most unlikely vessel can become the hand of destiny itself. Athens in the year 430 before the Common Era was a city at the height of its power and on the brink of catastrophe. As the Peloponnesian War raged, the Oracle of Delphi issued a chilling prophecy. Athena, the city's patron goddess, would protect Athens, but only if her people avoided wrongdoing against her sacred temple. Few heeded the warning. Then the plague came. Thucydides, the historian who survived the outbreak, left harrowing details. It began with sudden fevers, throat ulcers, and a stench so violent it drove birds from the skies. Victims' skin erupted in pustules, their insides burning until they threw themselves into cisterns seeking relief. The death toll was staggering. Some estimates suggest a third of Athens perished, including its leader Pericles. But what horrified Thucydides most wasn't the disease itself, it was how it unraveled society. Temples overflowed with corpses, looters robbed dying households. Survivors abandoned funeral rites, tossing bodies onto pyres at random. To the Greeks, this wasn't just illness, it was divine wrath made visible. The connection seemed obvious. Just before the plague, Athens had seized treasury funds from Delphi to fund its war against Sparta. Had Athena withdrawn her protection? Contemporary playwrights like Sophocles echoed the theme. His Oedipus Rex, written years later, mirrored Athens' torment with a city stricken by plague until a moral pollution was purged. Even Pericles' famous funeral oration, delivered as the plague raged, took on eerie irony. His praise of Athenian resilience rang hollow as bodies stacked up behind him. Modern epidemiologists have theories: typhus, typhoid fever, even an early Ebola-like virus. Excavations in mass graves revealed traces of Salmonella enterica, supporting the typhoid theory. But science can't explain why the plague spared Sparta entirely, or why Athens' outbreak coincided so precisely with its sacrilege. The duality remains: was this a tragic confluence of war and disease, or something more? Perhaps the true lesson lies in how the story evolved. Later historians like Diodorus claimed Apollo himself sent the plague, his statue at Delos shaking ominously beforehand. The Romans would later cite Athens as proof that gods punish hubris, a trope that echoes through every pandemic since. From the Black Death blamed on Jewish poisoners to AIDS branded as divine retribution, we still wrestle with the same impulse to read morality into misery. The Plague of Athens stands as history's first recorded case of this fatal instinct where faith and fear collide, and the line between virus and vengeance blurs beyond recognition. The sun was dipping below the Galilean hills as the crowd pressed closer, 5,000 men plus women and children drawn by rumors of healing and hope. Jesus' disciples wanted to send them away: no food, no provisions, just wilderness stretching in every direction. Then came the question that would echo through 2 millennia: how many loaves do you have? 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, they answered, a child's meal. And yet, when the fragments were gathered afterward, they filled 12 baskets, not just enough, but overflowing. This moment, recorded in all 4 Gospels, is more than a miracle. It's a layered puzzle that early Christians turned over like a sacred gem. Mark's account, likely the earliest, frames it as a test of faith, the disciples' inability to grasp divine providence. John's version, written decades later, adds striking symbolism. The bread is barley, the poor man's grain, and the 12 baskets mirror the 12 tribes of Israel. Was this a sign that the long-awaited Messiah could feed not just bodies but souls? Artists seized on the imagery. In 3rd century catacomb frescoes, the scene appears beside Jonah's resurrection, both symbols of life from scarcity. Byzantine mosaics shimmer with golden tessera, depicting Jesus not as a robed teacher but as a cosmic ruler, his hand outstretched over baskets that multiply like stars. The message was clear: this wasn't just about bread. It was about the Eucharist, about Christ as the bread of life who could satisfy humanity's deepest hunger. Scholar debates rage even today. Some point to ancient feeding stories in pagan traditions, miracles attributed to figures like Elisha or the Greek god Asclepius, suggesting the tale borrowed familiar tropes. Others argue for a shared meal theory, that the real miracle was crowd members inspired to share hidden provisions, transforming selfishness into abundance. But the Gospels insist something transcendent occurred, not just symbolism, but a rupture in the natural order. Perhaps the most provocative reading comes from the early Church Fathers. Augustine saw the 5 loaves as representing the 5 books of Moses, now fulfilled in Christ. The fragments gathered symbolized unity, many parts forming one body, foreshadowing the Church itself. And those 12 baskets, the apostles tasked with carrying this abundance to the world. What makes this miracle endure isn't the spectacle of multiplication, but its radical promise that in the hands of the divine, even our scarcest resources, our doubts, our frailties, can become more than enough. 2,000 years later, whether you read it as history or allegory, the question remains: is the miracle what happened that day on the hillside, or what happens when we dare to believe it could? The air in Bethany was thick with grief. 4 days had passed since Lazarus was sealed in his tomb, his body already decaying in the heat. Jewish tradition held that the soul lingered near the body for 3 days before departing. By the 4th, resurrection was unthinkable. Yet when Jesus arrived, he didn't offer condolences. He asked for the stone to be rolled away, then uttered words that would echo through eternity: "Lazarus, come out." What makes this miracle unique isn't just its spectacle, it's its timing. In John's Gospel, written around 90 of the Common Era, this is the final and most audacious of Jesus' 7 signs, each designed to reveal his divine identity. Unlike earlier healings done quietly, this one was public, deliberate, and explosive. The crowd included not just mourners but Pharisees, their presence turning the event into a political detonator. When Lazarus emerged, still wrapped in burial linens, the reaction was immediate. Some believed, while others raced to Jerusalem to report what they'd seen. Early Christians saw layers of meaning here. The early church father Tertullian called it a preview of Christ's own resurrection, with Lazarus's grave clothes mirroring the folded burial shroud left in Jesus' empty tomb. John's inclusion of details like Martha's protest, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor," serves a theological purpose. Resurrection isn't a metaphor but a messy, physical reality. For a community facing persecution, this wasn't just a story. It was proof that even death could be undone, but beneath the miracle lies a darker tension. The Gospel notes that the raising of Lazarus directly triggered the plot to kill Jesus. The high priest Caiaphas even argued it was better for one man to die than for the Romans to destroy the nation. John frames this as divine irony. The miracle that sealed Jesus' fate also foreshadowed his victory over it. Modern scholars highlight how John uses the story to critique Jewish authorities, reflecting late 1st century tensions between emerging Christianity and synagogue leaders after the temple's destruction. The story's historical plausibility has been debated for centuries. Some suggest Lazarus was in a coma, though this fails to explain the 4-day gap or the stench described. Others see it as a theological parable later inserted into Jesus' biography. But for believers, the power lies in its raw confrontation with mortality. In a world where grief feels final, the image of a man stepping from a tomb alive, bewildered, still trailing the scent of death, offers a promise that defies logic. Perhaps that's why Lazarus himself became a legend. Early traditions claim he never smiled again, as if he'd glimpsed something beyond human joy. Eastern Orthodox icons depict him with tightly wrapped limbs, symbolizing the constraints of earthly life. And when medieval artists painted the scene, they often showed Jesus not as a serene miracle worker, but as a figure straining with effort, as if resurrection, even for him, required everything. 2,000 years later, the question lingers, was this a literal event or John's way of proclaiming that in Christ, death itself is negotiable? Either way, the story's grip on the imagination endures. Because whether you read it as history or metaphor, the message is the same. When all seems lost, when hope has already begun to rot, there's still a voice that can call life from the darkest of places. And sometimes, just sometimes, the tomb opens. Constantinople was burning. The year was 532, and the Nika riots had turned the heart of the Byzantine Empire into a war zone. For 5 days, chariot racing factions, the Blues and Greens, had united in rage against Emperor Justinian, their grievances over taxes and corruption exploding into full-scale rebellion. Buildings crumbled under torchlight, senators were dragged through the streets, and half the city was in ashes. The mob crowned a rival emperor in the Hippodrome as Justinian's advisors begged him to flee. Then, as flames licked toward his crown jewel, the newly built Hagia Sophia, something impossible happened. Procopius, the era's most meticulous historian, recorded what eyewitnesses swore they saw: a wall of fire erupting between the rioters and the great church, its flames defying the wind to curve like a protective shield. The blaze didn't spread to the cathedral, it repelled the mob. Justinian, seizing the moment, sent his general Belisarius to crush the revolt in the Hippodrome. By dawn, 30,000 rebels lay dead, but Hagia Sophia stood untouched. The timing defied logic. The riots had destroyed the original church on that site just days earlier. Justinian had poured the empire's wealth into rebuilding it as a monument to divine glory. with a dome so vast it was said to hang from a chain suspended from heaven. Now, as his reign teetered on collapse, the very fire destroying Constantinople seemed to spare his masterpiece. Procopius, normally a skeptic, called it a miracle no prudent man could deny. Scholars still debate what really happened. Some suggest the fire was a controlled burn by Belisarius' troops, a military tactic misunderstood as divine intervention. Others point to Hagia Sophia's innovative design. Its wide courtyards and stone construction may have created natural firebreaks, but the deeper mystery lies in the ripple effects. The Nika massacre cemented Justinian's authority, allowing him to launch campaigns that briefly restored Rome's ancient borders. The saved Hagia Sophia became the architectural blueprint for Byzantine churches, its dome inspiring mosques and cathedrals for centuries. Perhaps the true miracle wasn't the fire itself, but what it made possible. In saving a building, it preserved a vision, one where human ambition and heavenly favor intertwined. To stand beneath that dome today is to stand where flames parted like the Red Sea, where history hinged on a moment so improbable, even the most rational mind hesitates. The rioters saw a tyrant's church. Justinian saw God's throne room, and the fire, it wrote the verdict in ashes. The night before the battle that would decide the fate of Rome, Constantine lay restless in his tent, weighing the odds. His forces were outnumbered by Maxentius' legions, and the Tiber River loomed behind them, a death trap if the battle turned. Then, as the historian Eusebius recorded, the sky itself seemed to split open. Constantine later swore he saw a blazing cross superimposed on the sun with the words, "In this sign conquer." His troops reported a similar vision. Some described the Greek letters Chi and Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name, glowing in the heavens. The next morning, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol on their shields. What followed wasn't just a military victory. It was the moment Christianity went from persecuted faith to imperial religion. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 became legend almost instantly. Maxentius' army, despite superior numbers, collapsed into chaos. Their retreat across the Tiber turned deadly when makeshift bridges gave way, drowning the would-be emperor in full armor. To Constantine's supporters, the message was divine. The Christian God had chosen a new champion. Within a year, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity across the empire. But the real question isn't what happened after the vision, it's what actually happened that night. Modern scholars dissect the accounts with forensic precision. Eusebius, writing decades later, had clear motives to frame Constantine's conversion as miraculous. Other sources, like Lactantius, mention only a dream instructing Constantine to place the heavenly sign on shields no celestial light show. Some historians suggest the Chi-Rho wasn't uniquely Christian at the time. It appeared in pagan context as a symbol of good fortune. Could Constantine have been blending faiths, hedging his bets? The timing is suspicious too. The vision came just as he needed to unite a divided army under a new banner. Yet the battle's outcome defies pure pragmatism. Maxentius held every advantage, higher ground, fortified positions, even prophecies from Rome's Sibylline books predicting his victory. For Constantine to win so decisively, with troops galvanized by a symbol they barely understood, strains coincidence. Even skeptical historians admit something extraordinary occurred, whether psychological, meteorological, or supernatural. The rain of light some described could have been a rare solar halo effect, its cross-like appearance striking awe into superstitious soldiers. The vision's legacy eclipses the debate over its origin. Overnight, Christianity shifted from catacombs to palaces. Constantine's reign saw the first churches built over martyrs' graves, the Nicene Creed formulated to unify doctrine, and the seeds planted for Christianity's eventual dominance of Europe. Critics argue he exploited the faith for control, pointing to his delayed baptism until his deathbed, as if hedging his bets. But the artifacts remain. coins minted with the Cairo, laws protecting Christians, and the eerie persistence of that symbol in later Roman triumphs. Perhaps the truest miracle lies in how a single night's vision altered civilization's course. Whether sent by God, conjured by ambition, or born of desperation, that sign in the sky became the blueprint for a new world, one where faith and empire walked hand in hand. And 1,200 years later, when explorers planted crosses in the New World, they were still following the shadow of a sign seen by a troubled emperor on the eve of his destiny. The waters stood like walls. That's the image etched into collective memory, the moment in the 13th century before the Common Era when, according to the book of Exodus, Moses stretched out his hand and the Red Sea split apart, allowing the Israelites to flee Pharaoh's chariots. It's a scene immortalized in art, from Renaissance paintings to Hollywood epics, but beneath the spectacle lies a mystery that bridges faith and science. How does one of history's most iconic miracles hold up under the lens of modern scrutiny? Start with the biblical account. The Exodus narrative describes an east wind blowing all night, driving back the waters to create a corridor of dry land with walls of water on either side. Egyptian forces attempting to pursue are swallowed when the sea crashes back. The story's power isn't just in the spectacle, it's in its symbolism. For enslaved Israelites, the parted sea marked a threshold between bondage and freedom, a divine demolition of the barriers holding them captive. Early Jewish interpreters saw it as the ultimate act of covenant fidelity, while early Christians read it as prefiguring baptism, liberation through water. But could physics explain part of the phenomenon? In the 1980s, researchers proposed a wind set-down theory, where sustained winds of over 60 miles per hour could temporarily push shallow waters aside, particularly in the Nile Delta's marshy Lake Tanis, a possible alternate site to the Red Sea. Computer models later showed such events could expose land bridges for several hours, enough time for a group to cross. Even the walls of water description aligns with hydraulic behavior during extreme wind events. Skeptics pounce on this as proof the miracle was natural, yet the timing remains eerily precise. The waters recede just as the Israelites arrive, then return at the exact moment to thwart their pursuers. The story's cultural echoes are equally fascinating. Ancient Near Eastern texts like the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh feature gods parting waters, suggesting a shared regional motif. But Exodus subverts these tropes here. The sea isn't split by a storm god for chaos, but by a liberator for deliverance. The difference is theological dynamite. Divinity isn't capricious, but aligned with the oppressed. Perhaps the most provocative parallel comes from the Ipuwer papyrus, an Egyptian text describing plagues and a river turned to blood centuries before Moses. While likely referencing a separate disaster, its overlap with Exodus plagues hints at how real catastrophes might have woven into collective memory. What's undeniable is the story's endurance, from spirituals like Go Down Moses, sung by enslaved Africans, to the civil rights movement's framing of racial justice as a new exodus. The Red Sea remains a metaphor for impossible barriers overcome. Science may explain the mechanics of wind and water, but it can't account for why this moment, above all others, became a compass for hope across 3 millennia. Maybe that's the real miracle, not just a sea parting, but a story that keeps making waves. Sister Agnes Sasagawa knelt in prayer inside the small convent chapel in Akita, Japan, when she noticed something impossible. The wooden statue of the Virgin Mary before her was weeping. Not just a trickle, but thick, viscous tears that rolled down its cheeks and pooled on the altar. It was June 28, 1973, the beginning of a phenomenon that would last years, drawing scientists, priests, and skeptics to this remote mountain town. But the tears were only the start. The statue would later bleed from a wound on its hand, its expressions seeming to shift with sorrow, and Sister Agnes. She bore her own stigmata, a cross-shaped wound that appeared and disappeared without explanation. The events at Akita didn't unfold in isolation. Sister Agnes, a convert from Buddhism who'd lost her hearing years earlier, had been receiving visions since earlier that year, a radiant woman identifying herself as the Mother of the Lord, warning of global calamities unless humanity turned back to prayer. The messages echoed those of Fátima half a century prior with eerie specificity: fires from the sky, persecution of the faithful, even the downfall of entire nations. But what set Akita apart was its tangible evidence, the tears themselves. Samples sent to labs at the University of Akita tested positive for human blood and tissue, a finding that baffled researchers. Skeptics scrambled for explanations: hidden reservoirs of liquid, a pious hoax, yet no mechanical tampering was ever found, and the weeping occurred unpredictably, witnessed by dozens, including the local bishop. The church's response was cautious but telling. Bishop John Ito, initially skeptical, became a staunch advocate after witnessing the statue's tears firsthand. By 1984, after a decade of investigation, Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, declared the events worthy of belief, a rare formal endorsement. This wasn't just about the tears, it was the convergence of physical evidence, Sister Agnes's prophetic messages. One predicted a future chastisement worse than the flood, a phrase that unnerved Cold War-era officials, and the nun's miraculous recovery from total deafness, all without medical intervention. Critics point to psychological explanations. Some suggest Sister Agnes's fervent devotion triggered psychosomatic stigmata, while the statue's tears could have been condensation or resin leakage, though neither explains the blood. Others note the timing. Japan in the 70s was a nation torn between rapid modernization and spiritual hunger, ripe for a resurgence of mysticism. Yet the blood tests complicate dismissal, as does the statue's later behavior. On the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, it allegedly wept more intensely, as if mourning. The parallels to Fátima are undeniable. Both involved three prophetic messages, both warned of global suffering, both were initially met with ecclesiastical skepticism. But Akita's miracles were quieter, more intimate tears instead of a spinning sun, a hand wound rather than angelic apparitions. Perhaps that's why it resonates in our era of doubt, not as spectacle but as silent witness. The statue still stands in Akita today, its face streaked with dried traces of those impossible tears, not proof, but a question carved in wood and blood. What if the divine still weeps for what we've become? The English Channel should have been a death trap. In late May 1940, over 300,000 Allied troops were pinned against the coast at Dunkirk, their backs to the sea, the German army closing in like a vise. Bombers strafed the beaches, turning sand into shrapnel. Then, against all odds, the weather itself seemed to take sides. A stillness settled over the Channel, waves flattening to glass, winds dying midair, while an unseasonable fog rolled in to blind the Luftwaffe. Soldiers wading into the shallows swore they glimpsed figures moving through the mist, silhouettes too tall to be men, guiding lost platoons to evacuation boats. Some described hearing hymns where no singers stood. By the time the last rescue vessel left Dunkirk's shores, what military planners had called Operation Dynamo would be remembered as the miracle of Dunkirk, not just for the calm seas, but for the whispers of something beyond human effort pulling the British Empire back from the brink. Eyewitness accounts read like pages from an old war hymn. Private Thomas Dawson of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment wrote to his sister of a phantom in white who led his company through minefields under cover of fog. A naval officer aboard the HMS Keith reported watching Stukas dive blindly through the mist, their bombs splashing harmlessly wide as if an unseen hand nudged them off course. Even hard-bitten war correspondents noted the eerie timing, how the Channel, notorious for its sudden storms, lay placid for 9 straight days, allowing everything from destroyers to fishing trawlers to ferry men to safety. The numbers defied belief. Nearly 900 vessels, most civilian, evacuated 338,000 men with losses far below what Churchill had feared. The Prime Minister himself stoked the divine intervention narrative in his famous "We shall fight on the beaches" speech. Though he never explicitly mentioned angels, his phrasing, "a miracle of deliverance," echoed sermons preached in British churches that June. Clergy pointed to the fog as divine intervention, comparing it to the pillar of cloud that shielded Israelites in Exodus. The press amplified the idea, with newspapers like the Daily Mirror printing soldiers' accounts of celestial rescuers under headlines like "Guardian Angels of Dunkirk." For a nation bracing for invasion, the story wasn't just comfort, it was cosmic reassurance that God hadn't abandoned Britain. Military historians offer rational explanations. The calm waters, they note, coincided with a rare high-pressure system, while the fog resulted from an unusual clash of warm inland air and cool channel currents. The phantom rescuers might have been exhaustion-induced hallucinations in sleep-deprived troops, but even skeptics struggle to explain the statistical improbability of it all. The precise alignment of weather, the low casualty rate among overcrowded evacuation boats, the fact that Hitler halted the Panzer advance just long enough for the operation to begin. Perhaps the most compelling evidence lies in the aftermath. The evacuated troops, dubbed the Dunkirk Spirit, became the core of Britain's defense during the Blitz. Many carried an unshakable conviction that they'd been spared for a purpose. Decades later, veterans at reunions still debated what they'd seen in that fog. Some insisted it was mass delusion, others held firm there were no angels. One told the BBC in 1980, but there was something. In the end, Dunkirk's miracle wasn't just in the weather or even the evacuation. It was how a nation on the edge of collapse found, in the space between fog and faith, the will to keep fighting. Whether divine or natural, the event became something greater, proof that even in war's darkest hour, the inexplicable can tip the scales. And sometimes that's enough. The fumes rising from the cleft in the rock smelled like rotten eggs, a scent ancient pilgrims would recognize as the breath of the gods. At the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, seekers from across the Greek world climbed the sacred way, past treasure houses filled with gold, to ask one question of the Pythia: what does the future hold? This wasn't fortune-telling. It was diplomacy, warfare, and personal destiny distilled into a single, gas-induced utterance. And the answers, cryptic as they were, shaped the ancient world in ways no one could have predicted. Take Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia. Before launching an attack on Persia in 546 before the Common Era, he sent emissaries to Delphi with a simple query: should I go to war? The Pythia's reply was classic oracle ambiguity: if you cross the river Halys, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus took it as a green light, only to watch his own kingdom crumble beneath Persian swords. In his despair, he sent chains to Delphi as a reproach, accusing the oracle of deceit. The priests calmly replied, "You asked about an empire, not which one." The mechanics behind these prophecies were as fascinating as their outcomes. Modern geologists discovered ethylene gas seeping from the temple's limestone faults, a sweet-smelling vapor known to induce trances. The Pythia, always a local woman over 50 chosen for her piety, would chew laurel leaves, breathe the fumes, then deliver her riddles while priests translated her ravings into verse. It wasn't fraud, it was chemistry harnessed by ritual. Even the temple's location was deliberate, built atop intersecting fault lines the Greeks called the omphalos, the navel of the world. But Delphi's real power lay in its political neutrality. City-states at war would both consult the Pythia, receiving answers vague enough to justify any outcome. Before the Persian Wars, Athens was told to trust their wooden walls, interpreted by some as their navy, by others as literal fortifications. Sparta received even darker counsel: either your glorious city must be sacked, or a king of the Heraclid line must perish. When King Leonidas fell at Thermopylae, it cemented the oracle's reputation for unshakable accuracy. Alexander the Great, never one for ambiguity, allegedly dragged the Pythia from the temple when she initially refused to see him. Grabbing her by the hair, he demanded a prophecy until she gasped, "You are invincible, my son." It became his battle cry across 3 continents. Whether the story is true or myth, it reveals how even the greatest minds bent to Delphi's authority. Why did the Greeks, masters of logic and reason, put such faith in riddles? Perhaps because the oracle didn't predict the future, it revealed the hidden contours of human nature. Every prophecy was a mirror, reflecting back the hopes and blind spots of those who sought it. When Oedipus was told he'd kill his father and marry his mother, he fled Corinth in horror, only to fulfill the prophecy by trying to escape it. The lesson wasn't about fate's inevitability, but the danger of half-understood truths. Today, we dismiss Delphi as primitive psychology or geological coincidence. But walk those ruined slopes at dusk with the wind howling through the Phaedriades cliffs, and you might feel it, the eerie sense that something once spoke here. Not just gas, not just poetry, but a voice that knew the oldest truth of all. The future isn't written in stone or smoke. It's written in the choices we make when faced with the unknowable. And sometimes the most divine intervention is simply being forced to think deeper. The linen cloth measures 14 feet long by 3.5 feet wide, its surface bearing the faint imprint of a man's body front and back, as if pressed between heat and blood. This is the Shroud of Turin, Christianity's most debated relic, a mystery woven from faith, science, and centuries of fervent controversy. To believers, it's the very burial cloth that wrapped Jesus after the crucifixion, its mysterious image a divine stamp of resurrection. To skeptics, it's an elaborate medieval forgery, a pious hoax from the age of knights and cathedrals. But the truth, it's far stranger than either camp might imagine. The shroud first appeared definitively in historical records in the 1350s, when French knight Geoffroy de Charny placed it in a church at Liry. Almost immediately, it drew accusations of fraud. A local bishop even claimed the artist had confessed. Yet the image itself defied explanation. No pigments or brushstrokes could be detected, just a superficial discoloration of the linen fibers. The figure bore over 100 wounds matching gospel accounts of the crucifixion. Scourge marks, a pierced side, even what appeared to be nail wounds through the wrists, an anatomical detail medieval artists consistently got wrong, depicting nails through the palms instead. Then came the science. In 1978, a team of researchers under the Shroud of Turin research project subjected the cloth to unprecedented scrutiny. Their findings ignited more questions than answers. The bloodstains tested positive for hemoglobin and contained traces of bilirubin, a compound present in severe trauma victims. The image itself wasn't painted but resembled a photographic negative, a detail unnoticed until 1898, when amateur photographer Secondo Pia saw the ghostly positive emerge in his darkroom. Scientists theorized everything from medieval radiation bursts to chemical reactions between burial spices and body sweat. But no hypothesis fully explained the image. Three-dimensional encoding information depth no known medieval technique could replicate. The carbon dating controversy only deepened the enigma. In 1988, labs at Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson dated samples to between 1260 and 1390, squarely in the medieval period. Case closed? Not quite. Critics pointed to the samples' questionable provenance, possibly taken from a rewoven section repaired after a fire in the 1500s. Later studies noted microbial contamination and vanillin levels inconsistent with medieval linen, suggesting the shroud might indeed be far older. The debate rages on, with some researchers now proposing the carbon date reflects a medieval, invisible reweave technique. Pilgrims care little for lab reports. To them, the shroud is a tactile connection to the divine, a sacred object venerated by millions, including Pope John Paul II, who called it a mirror of the gospel. Every public exhibition draws crowds so vast that Turin's streets gridlock with faithful. Yet perhaps the shroud's greatest power lies in what it refuses to do, offer certainty. It exists in the liminal space between artifact and icon, its very ambiguity a challenge. Is it proof of resurrection, a medieval masterpiece, or something else entirely? An object that somehow, against all odds, carries whispers of the first Easter morning. The shroud never claims to be what believers or skeptics want it to be. It simply is a mute witness to history's greatest mystery, its secrets locked in flax fibers older than nations. Whether divine or human in origin, it endures as a Rorschach test for the soul, asking not, "Do you believe?" but something far more unsettling. What do you see when you stand face to face with the inexplicable? The banquet hall glowed with stolen gold. King Belshazzar of Babylon had ordered the sacred vessels plundered from Jerusalem's temple to be filled with wine, his nobles toasting gods of gold and bronze as musicians played. Then, without warning, fingers appeared hovering near the lampstand, tracing fiery letters into the plaster wall. The king's face drained of color, his knees knocked together. And in that moment of terror, as recorded in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, the most famous supernatural graffiti in history spelled out a kingdom's doom: Min, Min, Tekel, Parsin. At first glance, the story reads like divine justice, a proud ruler defiling holy objects, only to be humbled by celestial intervention. But dig deeper, and the tale unravels historical layers. The Bible portrays Belshazzar as Nebuchadnezzar's son and last king of Babylon, yet ancient records list him as a co-regent under his father, Nabonidus. Archaeologists even found tablets referencing Belshazzar's administrative role during Nabonidus' decade-long absence. So why the discrepancy? Scholars suggest the author of Daniel, writing centuries later during Jewish oppression under Antiochus Epiphanes, condensed Babylonian history to make a theological point: empires that mock the divine inevitably fall. The words themselves are a linguistic puzzle. Written in Aramaic, they seem to list units of currency: a min, a mina, a tekel, a shekel, and parsin, half-minas. But when the prophet Daniel deciphers them, they morph into a triple verdict: numbered, weighed, divided. Babylon's days were counted, its ruler found wanting, its kingdom destined for the Medes and Persians. Wordplay wasn't just clever, it was subversive. The same language Babylon used for trade became the medium of its judgment, as if divinity hijacked human systems to deliver its message. Artists couldn't resist the drama. Rembrandt's 1635 painting Belshazzar's Feast captures the instant the writing appears, the king recoiling as golden light sears the wall. What's often overlooked is Rembrandt's audacious detail. He rendered the Aramaic script vertically instead of right to left, a mistake some argue was intentional, making the text unreadable to viewers, mirroring Belshazzar's own bafflement. William Blake took a darker approach, his watercolor showing the king's face twisted in horror as spectral fingers carve words like claws. But the story's true power lies in its irony. Belshazzar's feast coincided with the night Persian forces diverted the Euphrates to breach Babylon's walls, a fact the revelers inside never noticed. The writing wasn't just prophecy, it was a cosmic punchline. While the king scrambled to decode the message, his empire was already being weighed and divided by invaders wading through the riverbed. By sunrise, Belshazzar lay dead, and Cyrus the Great entered a city too drunk to resist. Centuries later, the phrase, handwriting on the wall, entered global vernacular as shorthand for impending doom. Yet few remember its origins: a drunken monarch, a stolen chalice, and letters that burned brighter than any feast's torches. Whether read as history, allegory, or divine theater, the tale endures because it asks a haunting question. When the signs of our own unraveling appear, will we be too distracted by the revelry to read them? The priest's hands trembled as he held the host, not from age or fear, but from the impossibility unfolding before him. In the 8th century, in the small Italian town of Lanciano, a Basilian monk wrestling with doubts about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist watched as the sacramental bread in his hands transformed into living flesh. The wine in the chalice thickened into globules of blood, coagulating into 5 irregular pellets as the stunned congregation gasped. This was no fleeting vision. It was a physical alteration that would endure for over 12 centuries, challenging science and faith alike. What makes Lanciano unique isn't just the medieval account, but the modern scrutiny it's endured. In 1970, the Catholic Church permitted a team of scientists to examine the relics. Dr. Edoardo Linoli, a professor of anatomy and pathology, led the study, expecting to debunk the phenomenon. Instead, his findings sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The flesh was identified as cardiac muscle tissue specifically, the myocardium of a human heart containing arteries, veins, and even traces of white blood cells. The blood type AB matched later discoveries of the Shroud of Turin and other Eucharistic miracles. More astonishingly, the tissue showed no signs of preservation, yet had resisted decay for over 1,000 years without natural explanation. The implications ripple far beyond anatomy. In Catholic theology, the Eucharist's transformation, where bread and wine become Christ's body and blood while retaining their appearance, is called transubstantiation. Lanciano's miracle presents a rare physical manifestation of this doctrine, a tangible rebuttal to skeptics who dismiss it as mere symbolism. The Church's authentication process was meticulous. After initial local veneration, Pope Sixtus IV formally recognized the miracle in the 15th century, and subsequent popes granted the site special indulgences. Today, the relics remain displayed in a silver monstrance at the Sanctuary of the Miracle in Lanciano, drawing pilgrims who seek to stand where faith and flesh intersected. Skeptics propose alternative theories. Some suggest the flesh could be a rare type of desiccated fungus or a medieval hoax using animal tissue. But Linoli's analysis dismantled these claims. The tissue's cellular structure was undeniably human, and the blood's protein composition defied contamination or forgery. Even secular historians acknowledge the event's cultural impact. Lanciano became a crossroads for crusaders traveling to the Holy Land who spread the story across Europe. Debates aside, the miracle's endurance is itself a marvel. The flesh, though centuries old, remains pliable under examination, and the blood pellets retain their peculiar properties when weighed individually. Each has a different mass, but when placed together, their combined weight equals that of a single pellet. This oddity, noted in medieval chronicles, was reconfirmed in modern tests, leaving physicists scratching their heads. Perhaps the deepest mystery isn't the how, but the why. Why this moment, this doubting priest, this quiet town? Theology offers no tidy answers, only the whisper of a pattern. That sometimes the divine meets doubt not with rebuke but with evidence. Not with a voice from the heavens, but with flesh that can be weighed, blood that can be tested. Lanciano doesn't ask for blind faith. It invites the curious to look closer, to touch the edge of a mystery that science can dissect but never quite explain. And in an age of skepticism, that may be the most miraculous thing of all. The desert at night is a sea of shadows, cold, trackless, and vast. For the Israelites fleeing Egypt in the 13th century before the Common Era, each step into the wilderness was a gamble with death. Then, as the book of Exodus recounts, the darkness itself seemed to part. A pillar of fire appeared, illuminating the sands with an unearthly glow, its flames never flickering, never dimming. By day, it transformed into a column of smoke, shielding the refugees from the scorching sun. For 40 years, this phenomenon would guide them, a celestial compass pointing toward the promised land. But what was it, divine manifestation, or something the earth itself conjured? Geologists have long noted the Sinai Peninsula's volcanic history. Mount Sinai, traditionally identified as Jebel Musa, lies in a region where subterranean vents still simmer. Some scholars suggest the pillar of fire could have been a distant volcanic plume. its ash cloud appearing as smoke by day and reflecting magma's glow at night. The description of Mount Sinai wrapped in smoke and trembling during the giving of the Ten Commandments further fuels this theory. Even the fire itself aligns with documented volcanic phenomena. Strombolian eruptions, for instance, produce steady, pillar-like flames visible for miles. Yet the biblical narrative resists purely natural explanations. The pillar doesn't just appear, it intervenes. It halts Pharaoh's chariots at the Red Sea, descends to crown the tabernacle, and vanishes only when the Israelites enter Canaan. Its behavior mirrors later descriptions of the Shekinah, the divine presence that filled Solomon's temple. This isn't atmospheric disturbance, it's a character in the story with intention and timing that defy coincidence. Rabbi Akiva, writing in the 2nd century, called it God's outstretched arm, not metaphorically but literally, a visible extension of the divine into human history. The pillar's legacy shaped Israel's identity. The tabernacle, a portable shrine built during the wilderness years, was designed around its movements. When the pillar settled, the people camped. When it lifted, they marched. This rhythm turned nomads into a nation, their very survival tied to watching the skies. Centuries later, prophets like Isaiah would recall the pillar as proof of God's covenant faithfulness, a symbol that guidance comes even in the barren places. Modern minds may debate whether the pillar was miracle or mirage, but its cultural impact is undeniable. From Renaissance art showing Moses bathed in fiery light to spirituals like Guide My Feet echoing the wilderness journey, the image endures as a metaphor for divine accompaniment. Perhaps that's the point, not to explain the pillar's physics, but to ask a deeper question. When you stand at life's crossroads, what unexpected beacons might be lighting your way, if only you have the eyes to see? The rain fell in sheets over Knock, Ireland, that August evening in 1879, turning the muddy village square into a mirror of the dreary sky. But when 15 villagers gathered near the church, ranging from a 6-year-old girl to a 75-year-old widow, they saw something that would etch their sleepy parish into religious history. There, bathed in an unearthly golden light against the church's south gable, stood 3 figures, the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, and Saint John the Evangelist, silent and radiant. No words were spoken, no prophecies given. The vision lasted nearly 2 hours, long enough for villagers to kneel in the downpour, reciting the rosary as their soaked clothes clung to them. What set Knock apart from other Marian apparitions was its haunting stillness. At Lourdes, Bernadette Soubirous had conversed with the Virgin. At Fátima, the children received dire warnings. Here, there was only presence, a tableau vivant of Mary draped in white, her hands raised in prayer, flanked by saints frozen in celestial solemnity. Some witnesses described a lamb on an altar beside John, who held a book as if mid-sermon. The absence of dialogue fueled skepticism, but also lent the event a peculiar power. Without messages to dissect or dispute, the focus became the vision's sheer improbability. How could 15 people, including a Protestant policeman who happened upon the scene, hallucinate the same intricate scene simultaneously? Ireland's context deepened the impact. The country was still reeling from the Great Famine's scars, its people clinging to faith amid poverty and political unrest. Knock's vision arrived like a bomb, a silent reassurance when words felt inadequate. Pilgrims began trickling in within days, then flooding in thousands, many pressing handkerchiefs to the church wall where the figures had appeared, hoping for healing. The parallels to Lourdes were inevitable, but Knock's quieter mystique carved its own niche. Where Lourdes became synonymous with miracles and spring water, Knock offered something rarer, a mystery that asked nothing but belief. The church's response was characteristically measured. Initial investigations dismissed the event as mass hysteria or reflected lantern light, but witness testimonies were too consistent to ignore. By 1936, a church commission declared the apparitions worthy of belief, though not mandatory for Catholics, a nuanced endorsement that respected skepticism while acknowledging the devout's fervor. Modern popes from John Paul II to Francis would later visit Knock, cementing its place in Catholic devotion. Science has offered few answers. Meteorologists confirmed no unusual weather that night. Psychologists noted the villagers' varied ages and backgrounds made collective hallucination unlikely. The closest parallel might be the miracle of the sun at Fátima, another instance where light behaved inexplicably for crowds. But Knock's enduring legacy isn't in its proofs or debates. It's in the way a rain-soaked evening in a forgotten village became a beacon for millions, a reminder that sometimes the divine speaks loudest in silence. Today, Knock's Basilica towers over the humble church where the vision appeared, a symbol of how small moments can reshape history. The original gable wall still stands, its stones worn smooth by a century of pilgrim hands. No flash of lightning, no thunderous voice, just three figures in the rain, and the unshakable sense that for 2 hours in 1879, heaven held its breath and showed its face. The grotto of Massabielle was little more than a damp recess in the rock, a place where pigs rooted for scraps and the town's poorest children gathered firewood. But on February 11, 1858, to 14-year-old Bernadette Soubirous, it became the stage for a mystery that would draw millions. While foraging near the cave, she heard a rush of wind, though the trees stood still. Then, in the shadowy cleft, a figure emerged, a young woman in white, with golden roses at her feet and a rosary draped over her arm. Bernadette would return 18 times over 5 months, each encounter deepening the vision's strangeness. The lady asked for a chapel to be built, kissed Bernadette's cheek, and finally revealed her name: "I am the Immaculate Conception." The declaration sent shockwaves through the church. Bernadette, an illiterate peasant, couldn't have known the phrase was dogma-defined just 4 years earlier, let alone grasped its theological weight. Skeptics accused her of fabrication, but on February 25th, the grotto yielded something undeniable: a spring. At the lady's direction, Bernadette scraped at the muddy ground until water bubbled up, water that soon gained a reputation for healing. A woman with a paralyzed arm immersed it and regained motion. A dying infant bathed in the water and lived. Within weeks, pilgrims arrived by the hundreds, filling bottles from the trickle Bernadette had unearthed. Science has scrutinized Lourdes like no other miracle site. The Medical Bureau, established in 1882, employs physicians of all faiths and none to document cures. Of 7,000 claimed healings, just 70 have been recognized as medically inexplicable, a designation requiring verification that the ailment was severe, diagnosed, sudden in resolution, and permanent. Among them, Marie Bailey, cured of tubercular peritonitis in 1907 after her organs visibly rearranged in moments; Vittorio Micheli, whose bone cancer vanished in 1963, leaving his disintegrating pelvis intact. Even secular researchers admit bafflement. The water itself shows no special properties, yet the healings often defy medical timelines. Critics propose psychological explanations. The placebo effect, they argue, might explain subjective improvements, but not the reconstruction of necrotic tissue. Others suggest spontaneous remission, though statistically, the concentration of such cases at Lourdes is astronomically improbable. The deeper mystery lies in the healing's selectivity. Why some are touched and not others, why terminal illness sometimes yields while chronic conditions persist. The Church, notably, never declares these events miracles outright, only that they lack scientific explanation, leaving room for both faith and doubt. Lourdes' true power may lie beyond medicine. Today, 6 million visitors annually, many in wheelchairs or on stretchers, process past the grotto where Bernadette once knelt. The spring flows at a rate of 32,000 gallons per day, filling baths where the sick still immerse themselves, hoping for grace. Few expect a cure, most seek something subtler: peace, resilience, or the solidarity of suffering shared. In this, Lourdes reflects Bernadette's own story: not sudden transformation, but quiet persistence. After the visions, she endured tuberculosis, ridicule, and a cloistered death at 35. Her body, exhumed 3 times and found incorrupt, rests in a Nevers convent, a paradox in itself. The girl who saw miracles never experienced one for herself. Perhaps that's the lesson etched into lured stones. The divine, if it intervenes, does so on terms beyond human understanding, not as a cosmic vending machine dispensing cures, but as a presence that meets us in the grottos of our own frailty, offering not certainty but companionship. And sometimes, just sometimes, a spring where none should flow. The sky above Olympus wasn't just weather, it was the wrath and whim of a god made manifest. When Zeus hurled his thunderbolt, mountains shattered, cities burned, and kings learned the price of arrogance. Greek myths brim with these moments of divine intervention, where the king of gods stepped into mortal affairs with terrifying precision. Take Heracles, his demigod son. Tormented by Hera's madness, the hero slaughtered his own family, only to find redemption when Zeus guided him to the oracle of Delphi, setting him on the path of the 12 labors. Here, the thunderbolt wasn't punishment but providence, a father's hand steering his child from ruin. Yet Zeus' interventions weren't always benevolent. When Lycaon, king of Arcadia, served him a grisly feast of human flesh to test his divinity, the god's response was swift and horrifying. Lightning reduced Lycaon's palace to ash before transforming him into a wolf, a permanent reminder that mortals who challenged the gods became cautionary tales. This duality defined Zeus' role, protector of oaths and guest friendship, yet merciless destroyer of hubris. The same god who shielded Odysseus from Poseidon's rage also incinerated Capaneus mid-boast during the siege of Thebes, striking him down as he scaled the city walls, screaming that not even Zeus could stop him. Spoiler, Zeus could, but myth wasn't the only arena where Zeus will seem palpable. Ancient historians recorded real events interpreted as his direct intervention. In 480 before the Common Era, Persian invaders sacked Athens, burning temples to the ground except the sacred olive tree atop the Acropolis, which miraculously regrew overnight. The Athenians saw Zeus and Athena's hand at work. Even more striking, in 356, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders, burned the night Alexander the Great was born. Plutarch claimed Artemis was too busy attending the birth to save her shrine, but locals insisted Zeus had redirected his lightning to herald the conqueror's arrival. Archaeology adds another layer. Excavations at Dodona, site of Zeus' oldest oracle, revealed thousands of lead tablets where petitioners asked if their plans had the god's favor. Lightning strikes near the sacred oak were considered his answers, a practice so trusted that kings like Pyrrhus of Epirus delayed campaigns based on these signs. Modern meteorologists might attribute the strikes to the region's high conductivity, but to the ancients the pattern was undeniable. When Zeus spoke, even skeptics listened. What's fascinating is how these stories mirror humanity's eternal struggle to make sense of chaos. A sudden storm sinking an enemy fleet, Zeus defending his favorites. A bolt splitting an old tree where 2 lovers once met, divine disapproval. Today, we'd call it climate or coincidence, but the Greeks saw a universe where every flash of lightning carried meaning, where the line between natural and supernatural was as thin as the air before a storm. Perhaps that's why these tales endure. They remind us that whether we blame fate, physics, or the fury of gods, we're all just trying to read the signs in the sky. The sky above the Coptic church in Zaytown, Egypt, cracked open with light on the evening of April 2, 1968. A hospital nurse across the street was the first to spot her, a luminous woman standing atop the dome, her arms outstretched in silent benediction. Within hours, crowds packed the streets, their faces upturned as the figure reappeared, now bathed in a radiance so intense it cast shadows on the pavement below. What followed wasn't a fleeting vision, but a spectacle that would repeat nightly for years. The woman, identified by Coptic Christians as the Virgin Mary hovered, knelt, even appeared to release doves of light that spiraled into the night. Police reports, Muslim scholars, and international journalists all confirmed it. Something unexplainable was happening over that humble church roof. Photographs from the time show a surreal scene. Thousands of believers and skeptics alike, their cameras pointed at the same patch of sky, capturing the same inexplicable glow. The images, developed in different labs across Cairo, all revealed the same silhouette: a robed woman with a faint halo, sometimes holding an olive branch, other times surrounded by what witnesses described as flames that didn't burn. Even Egypt's state-run newspaper, Al Ahram, typically hesitant to endorse religious claims, ran front-page coverage with the headline, "A Celestial Visitor in Zaytown." What made Zaytown extraordinary wasn't just the apparitions, but who saw them. In a country strained by sectarian tensions, the phenomena transcended faith lines. Muslims who revere Mary as Sayyidatuna Mariam in the Quran joined Coptic Christians in prayer beneath the dome. Eyewitness accounts included atheist government officials and foreign diplomats, hardened observers with no stake in religious fervor. One taxi driver, interviewed by Time magazine in 1968, shrugged and said, "I don't know if it's the Virgin or a spaceship, but my eyes don't lie." The political backdrop sharpened the mystery. Egypt was still reeling from its devastating loss to Israel in the Six-Day War a year earlier. President Nasser's secular regime, eager to unify a fractured nation, allowed the crowds to gather without interference, an unusual concession in an era when mass assemblies often meant unrest. Some historians argue the apparitions provided a rare moment of unity, a divine reprieve from earthly divisions. Others suggest the government tacitly endorsed the events to distract from post-war hardships. Either way, the effect was undeniable. For those nights in Zaytown, the usual boundaries between Muslim and Christian, skeptic and believer, blurred under a shared sky. Scientific investigations only deepened the intrigue. A team from Cairo University analyzed the light, ruling out projections, mass hysteria, or atmospheric anomalies. The church's dome, they noted, lacked the wiring or surfaces needed for elaborate hoaxes. Meanwhile, the Coptic Patriarchate quietly circulated an ancient prophecy attributed to Pope Theophilus, who in the 4th century reportedly dreamed of Mary appearing over a church in the district of Zaytown. Whether coincidence or fulfillment, the timing felt uncanny. Critics proposed theories: ball lightning, secret military flares, even CIA psychological operations, but none explained the consistency of the sightings across demographics or the healings claimed by some pilgrims. A blind woman swore her vision returned after seeing the light. A paralyzed boy allegedly walked for the first time after his parents brought him to the site. The Coptic Church, cautious amid Cold War-era suspicions of fabrication, waited years before formally recognizing the events as worthy of belief. Zaytown's legacy lingers in the quiet persistence of memory. Today, the church still stands, its dome unchanged except for a small plaque marking the apparitions. Pilgrims occasionally gather at dusk, hoping for another glimpse, though none have been reported since 1971. The real miracle, perhaps, wasn't just the light in the sky, but the way it forced a divided world to look up, if only for a moment, and wonder at something beyond the reach of politics or proof. In a time of wars and walls, Mary's silent appearances whispered a question that still hangs in the air. What if the divine doesn't take sides but meets us where we least expect? The year 451 was a time of terror for Europe. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, had turned his armies toward the heart of Gaul, leaving smoldering ruins and rivers choked with corpses in his wake. As news reached Paris, then a modest Roman settlement called Lutetia panic spread like wildfire. The city's bridges were clogged with fleeing citizens, their carts piled high with whatever they could carry. Only one voice urged them to stay, a young shepherdess turned nun named Genevieve. While leaders debated surrender, she gathered the women of the city to pray through the night, vowing that if they kept faith, Paris would be spared. Then, as if answering her plea, the impossible happened. Attila's forces, mere days from the city gates, abruptly changed course, veering south toward Orleans instead. To believers, it was a miracle etched in divine ink. Genevieve had reportedly fasted for 3 days, her prayers rising like a shield over the city. Medieval chroniclers later embellished the tale, claiming Attila himself saw a vision of the saint wielding a sword of heavenly fire, though no contemporary accounts mention such an apparition. What's undeniable is the outcome. Paris stood untouched while neighboring cities burned. The grateful populace declared Genevieve their patroness, and her relics would later be credited with ending plagues and droughts for centuries after her death. But history offers a more nuanced ledger. Attila, for all his brutality, was no mindless berserker, he was a tactician. By 451, his forces were overextended, his supply lines strained. Orleans, a wealthier and more strategic target, promised richer plunder and a clearer path to confront the Roman general Aetius. Meanwhile, Lutetia was a backwater, its marshy surroundings ill-suited for the Huns' cavalry. Some scholars suggest Genevieve's defiance may have actually encouraged Attila's decision. Why waste time on a city prepared to fight when softer targets lay ahead? The blending of legend and fact only deepens the intrigue. Genevieve's contemporary, Bishop Germain of Auxerre, documented her piety but never mentioned Attila's diversion, focusing instead on her charitable works. It wasn't until the 9th century that the connection solidified in texts like the Vita Genovi, where her intercession became inseparable from Paris' survival. This evolution reflects a timeless human impulse to sanctify the inexplicable, to see heavenly hands in history's turning points. What makes Genevieve's story endure isn't just the question of divine intervention, but its aftermath. Unlike other cities that erected victory monuments, Paris built chapels first to honor the saint, then to house her relics. During the Viking sieges 4 centuries later, her casket was paraded along the ramparts, and once again the invaders retreated. Coincidence, perhaps, but in the collective memory of a people, patterns emerge. Whether through prayer or providence, Genevieve became the embodiment of a city's resilience, a reminder that sometimes the fiercest shields are forged not of iron but of faith. Today, her name lingers in Parisian streets and squares, her story a prism through which we still grapple with the mysteries of history. Did she divert Attila through supernatural means, or was her unshakable calm the spark that rallied a city to defiance? The answer may depend on what you choose to see, the hand of the divine or the courage of a woman who refused to run. Either way, the lesson remains. In the face of annihilation, sometimes the bravest act is simply to stand, to pray, and to believe. From the whispering winds that saved Japan from Mongol fleets to the luminous figure hovering over a Cairo church, these stories of divine intervention span continents, faiths, and millennia. They unfold in trenches and temples, in deserts and city streets, each one a brushstroke in humanity's endless attempt to paint meaning onto the canvas of chaos. What unites them isn't dogma or doctrine, but something far more universal. The human longing to believe we're not alone in the universe, that something, whether called God, destiny, or the ineffable, sometimes bends the arc of history. Consider the contrasts. Joan of Arc's fiery visions guided armies, while Bernadette Soubirous' quiet apparitions drew the sick to a healing spring. The Shroud of Turin's mute mystery invites forensic scrutiny, while the dance of the sun at Fátima defied physics before 70,000 witnesses. Some interventions, like the Angel of Mons, arrived in war's darkest hour. Others, like the Lanciano Eucharist, answered a single priest's doubt. Yet whether grand or intimate, they all share that electrifying sense of the impossible breaking through, not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience etched into memory and stone. This tapestry of tales reveals a paradox. The divine, if it exists, refuses to be pinned down. It speaks in burning bushes and spinning suns, through statues that weep and storms that part at the perfect moment. It favors shepherds and soldiers, children and kings, leaving scientists and scholars to chase after meaning like shadows on a cave wall. Perhaps that's the point. These stories aren't meant to be solved like equations, but to awaken wonder, to remind us that mystery is woven into the very fabric of existence. So where does that leave us? You don't have to believe in miracles to recognize their power. Across time, they've inspired art, fueled revolutions, and given hope when all seemed lost. They've made empires pause and scientists rethink the boundaries of reality. Most of all, they've offered generations the same gift, the chance to look at the world and ask, what if there's more? Now it's your turn. Have you ever encountered something you couldn't explain? A moment where chance felt too precise or help arrived from nowhere? Share your stories below. We're all detectives in this great historical mystery. And if you're hungry for more journeys into the unexplained, hit subscribe. Who knows, the next story might just change how you see the world. Until then, keep wondering, keep questioning, and most of all, keep looking for the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. After all, history's greatest lesson is this: the impossible happens more often than we think.